I remember the cold more than anything else. The way it clung to my skin, how it seeped through my clothes no matter how many layers I had on. It wasn't just the temperature. It was the kind of cold that made you feel like you were being watched. A heavy, oppressive stillness that settled over everything. The air barely moved, the trees didn't sway, and even my own breath felt too loud in the silence. I had rented the cabin for a week, hoping for some peace and quiet. The idea of getting away from the city, from the constant buzz of traffic and people, had seemed like a good idea. I had pictured myself sitting by a fireplace, drinking coffee, reading a book, maybe even doing some writing. Just me and the wilderness. But the moment I arrived, something felt wrong. The cabin was small, tucked deep into the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The road leading up to it was barely a road at all, just a narrow path of packed dirt winding through the trees. My car's tires had struggled against the uneven ground, slipping in the patches of ice that hadn't melted from the last snowfall. By the time I reached the cabin, my nerves were already on edge. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No birds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the sound of my own breathing and the faint hum of the wind. The trees stood tall and motionless, their bare branches like skeletal fingers reaching toward the overcast sky. The cabin itself was simple. One room with a small bathroom, a kitchenette, and a fireplace that hadn't been used in a long time. Dust clung to the wooden furniture, and the air smelled stale, like old wood and dampness. There were no signs that anyone had been here recently. The owner had said he'd left the key under the doormat, but when I lifted it, there was nothing there. The door, however, was unlocked. That should have been my first warning. I pushed the thought aside, assuming the owner had forgotten to lock it the last time he was here. The inside was cold, colder than it should have been. I checked the thermostat, but it didn't seem to work. I had brought firewood, but I didn't want to use it all on the first night. Instead, I settled for bundling up in my thickest clothes, lighting a few candles for warmth, and trying to relax. But I couldn't. There was a feeling in the cabin, something I couldn't explain. It wasn't a noise or a shadow, just a presence, a weight pressing down on me. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see something standing in the tree line. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the isolation get to me. That first night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jolt awake. The wind against the windows, the creaking of the wooden walls as the cabin settled, the distant snap of a branch outside. I told myself it was just the woods, just nature doing what it always did. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The second day, I tried to distract myself. I went for a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The forest was vast, stretching endlessly in all directions. I made sure to mark my way, scratching an X into the bark of trees every few feet. The last thing I needed was to get lost out here. About an hour in, I found something strange. Clearing, not a natural one. The trees had been cut down, the stumps left behind like broken teeth. In the center was something even stranger, a small pile of bones. They were clean, picked dry, arranged in a careful stack. Not scattered, not left behind by some animal, but placed there. Deliberate. A chill ran down my spine. I wasn't sure why, but I felt like I had just walked into something I wasn't supposed to see. My first instinct was to turn back, to get away from that place as fast as possible. But as I turned, I noticed something else. Something that made my breath catch in my throat. Footprints. Not mine. Fresh ones, leading away from the pile of bones and disappearing into the trees. Someone had been here, recently. I hurried back to the cabin, my heart pounding. I locked the door behind me, pushing a chair up against it for good measure. My brain scrambled for an explanation. Maybe a hunter? But why leave a pile of bones in the middle of nowhere? And why did I feel like I was being watched? That night was worse than the first. I kept the fireplace going, trying to push away the cold, but it didn't help. Sleep wouldn't come. I lay there in the flickering firelight, listening, waiting. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I heard it. A soft, deliberate knock on the door. I froze. My mind went blank. No one should have been out here. No one. The knock came again, a little louder this time. I stayed silent, barely breathing. My fingers tightened around the blanket, my body stiff with fear. Whoever was outside didn't try to open the door. They just stood there, waiting. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the door, expecting it to burst open at any second. But it never did. Eventually, the knocking stopped. The silence stretched on. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I made my decision. I had to leave. The problem was my car. It was parked about 100 yards from the cabin, near the edge of the tree line. If someone was out there, they would see me the second I stepped outside. I packed my things quickly, shoving everything into my bag with shaking hands. I peered out the window, scanning the tree line. Nothing. The woods were still and quiet. I took a deep breath, unlocked the door, and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a wall, but I ignored it. I kept my eyes on my car, moving quickly, my boots crunching against the frozen ground. Then I saw them, footprints, leading from the trees, circling my cabin, and stopping right outside my door. I ran. I didn't care how much noise I made, didn't care if whoever had been out here was still watching. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and turned the key. The engine sputtered but didn't start. I tried again, and again. On the third try, the engine roared to life. I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding down the narrow dirt road, barely keeping control as the car slid on patches of ice. I didn't stop, not until I saw the first signs of civilization. I never went back. I never even told anyone what happened. Who would believe me? It wasn't a ghost or some monster from a story. It was a person. Someone had been watching me, following me, and I don't know what they wanted. I don't want to know. I needed to get away. That was the only thing on my mind when I packed my truck and started driving. The stress had been getting to me, work, the noise of the city, the same people, the same streets, the same routine. I just wanted silence, space, and time to myself. So, I rented a cabin deep in the woods, far away from anyone or anything that could remind me of my life back home. The drive was long, and the roads became narrower as I got closer. Eventually, the pavement ended, leaving me on a dirt path surrounded by towering trees. The GPS signal was gone, but I had downloaded the map beforehand. According to it, I had about 5 more miles to go. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the treetops, and the further I drove, the less it felt like the modern world existed. There were no signs of people, no houses, no power lines, not even another car. It was exactly what I wanted. The cabin appeared just as the last bit of daylight faded. It was old but sturdy, with a slanted roof and a small porch. The wood was worn, but it had character. The moment I stepped out of the truck, the silence wrapped around me. No distant sounds of traffic, no humming of appliances, just the wind and the occasional rustling in the trees. Inside, the air was stale, but that was expected. It smelled like wood and dust, and the furniture looked like it had been there for decades. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a dim yellow light over the room. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bedroom with an old bed that creaked when I sat on it. I set up my things, unpacked a few clothes, put some food in the fridge, and checked my phone. No signal. That was fine. That was the point. The first night was peaceful. I read a book by the fireplace, listened to the sounds of the woods, and let myself relax for the first time in months. Felt good. But then, things started to change. It was little things at first. On the second morning, I found the front door slightly open. I was sure I had locked it before going to bed, but maybe I was mistaken. I shrugged it off. That night, I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal. I knew what animals sounded like. This was different. It was deliberate. Slow, careful steps just beyond the porch. I held my breath and waited, but when I finally got the courage to check, there was nothing there. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. I told myself it was probably a hiker, maybe someone passing through, but that didn't make sense. I was too far from any trails, and there were no other cabins nearby. I started feeling uneasy. I kept the door locked at all times. I kept my knife close. The next few nights, the sounds continued. Footsteps circling the cabin, a soft scratching on the walls, and then, on the fourth night, something worse. I woke up to a sound inside the cabin. It was faint, but it was there. A shift in the air, a creak in the floorboards. I stayed still, barely breathing. I wasn't alone. I reached for my knife and slowly sat up, straining my ears. The sound was coming from the main room. Something moving. Someone moving. I forced myself to stand, to move as silently as possible. The door to my room was slightly open, just enough for me to see. The front door was wide open. My heart pounded. I had locked it. I was sure of it. I didn't wait. I grabbed my truck keys, ran outside, and locked myself in my truck. I turned the engine on, headlights flooding the area. There was no one. Nothing. I sat there for what felt like hours, watching, waiting, but the woods were still. Eventually, I forced myself to go back inside. I checked every corner, every closet, every possible hiding spot. Nothing, but something had been there. I barely slept that night. The next day, I packed my things. I didn't care how much time I had left on the rental. I was done. I drove fast, not looking back, not stopping until I reached the highway. The moment my phone had service, I called the cabin owner. They were quiet for a moment before finally speaking. "You're not the first to leave early." I didn't want to be there. The drive up to the cabin had been long, too long, and the road turned into a mess of dirt and gravel for the last 30 miles. The rental car struggled on the uneven ground, the tires spitting up dust and loose stones, and every bump in the road made the suspension groan. The sun had started its slow descent behind the thick tree line, casting long shadows across the ground, stretching out like reaching fingers. I gripped the wheel tighter. I hadn't picked this place. It was forced on me by my brother, who thought I needed some time alone. "Disconnect, clear your head," he'd said. I didn't argue. I didn't have the energy. The cabin wasn't much, just a small wooden structure tucked away in the middle of nowhere. The trees surrounding it were thick and endless, swallowing up any sign of civilization. The nearest town was an hour away, a small, dying place with a gas station, a diner, and not much else. Perfect for solitude. The moment I stepped out of the car, I felt it, the silence. It wasn't just quiet. It was heavy, pressing in from all sides. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of life, just stillness. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The place smelled like old wood and dust, a stale scent that settled into the walls. There was a small kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, and a single bedroom with a narrow bed covered in a thin, itchy blanket. Functional but not welcoming. I went through the usual motions, unpacked my bag, checked my phone, no signal, and lit a fire in the wood stove as the night crept in. The air outside had turned cold fast. I sat in the chair by the fire, listening to the wood crackle, and for the first time in a long time, I let my thoughts wander. That was a mistake. I don't know how long I sat there, but at some point, something changed. The silence outside was no longer empty. It felt like it was watching. I tried to shake it off, but my gut twisted in a way I couldn't ignore. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out into the darkness. Nothing, just trees, their trunks barely visible under the dim moonlight. But the feeling stayed, that pressure, that weight of something unseen pressing against me. I locked the door, checked the windows, and told myself I was being paranoid. I sat back down, but the fire didn't feel warm anymore. The first sound came hours later, a dull, distant thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. My breath caught. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I stayed still, ears straining, waiting for another sound. Nothing. Then, just as I convinced myself I imagined it, another thud. Closer. I stood, heart hammering in my chest. I moved to the window again, slowly, carefully, and peered outside. The trees stood still. The ground was undisturbed, but something was there. I could feel it. The thudding continued, irregular, moving closer with each impact. My breath came in short, shallow bursts. I turned off the fire, plunging the cabin into darkness. I wanted to see outside without being seen myself. I moved to the window again, staring out. The sound had stopped. The forest was quiet. Then movement. A shape, barely visible, standing just at the tree line. Too far to make out details, but close enough to know it wasn't an animal. It was tall, motionless, watching. I didn't move. My body was locked in place, my pulse pounding in my ears. Minutes passed, maybe longer, and still it didn't move. Then, as if it knew I was watching, it stepped back into the trees, vanishing into the blackness. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin made my skin crawl. Every gust of wind against the walls sent a spike of panic through me. Morning took forever to come, but when it did, I went outside, searching for any sign that what I saw was real. The ground near the tree line was disturbed. Large impressions like footprints, but wrong. Too deep, too wide. I should have left right then. Should have packed my bag, gotten in the car, and never looked back. But I didn't. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was sleep-deprived, paranoid. The next night, it came back. This time, I heard it breathing. I don't know how to describe it, but it was deep, wrong. A sound that rumbled through the trees and seeped into my bones. I locked the door, sat on the floor with my back against the wall, and held my breath. It was closer now, right outside. A long, slow drag of breath, and then the handle of the door moved. I gripped the knife I had taken from the kitchen, but I knew it wouldn't matter. If it wanted in, it would get in. The handle stopped moving. The breathing grew fainter, retreating. I stayed on the floor until the first light of morning crept through the windows. Then I left. I didn't pack. I didn't turn off the fire. I didn't care. I got into the car and drove, barely able to keep my hands steady on the wheel. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, where my phone finally had service. I called my brother. I don't remember what I said, only that my voice shook the entire time. I never went back, never tried to find out what it was. Whatever stood outside that cabin that night, whatever breathed against that door, it wasn't human. And I don't ever want to know what it was. I should have never gone up there alone. I wanted to clear my head. That was the whole reason I rented the cabin. Just a small place in the woods, quiet, far from the city noise. I found it on some rental site, a little old cabin tucked away in the forest, deep enough that there were no neighbors but not so far that I couldn't drive back into town if I needed something. It seemed perfect at the time. The first night was peaceful, the kind of silence I hadn't experienced in years. No cars honking, no people talking, no distractions. Just the trees swaying in the wind, the occasional rustling of an animal moving through the brush. I remember sitting on the porch, drinking a beer, thinking I'd made the right decision coming here. The second night, I started noticing things. Small things. The door was slightly open when I woke up, even though I was sure I had locked it. I chalked it up to the wind. Then I found my flashlight lying in the dirt outside, even though I hadn't used it. Maybe I dropped it, I told myself. Maybe I forgot. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I went to bed early, exhausted from hiking all day. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't a normal wake-up. My body was on high alert. You know that feeling when something is just wrong? When your instincts scream at you even if you don't know why. That's what it was. I lay there listening. The forest was dead silent. Not even the wind. Then I heard it. A soft, deliberate sound, like someone shifting their weight on the porch. Slow, careful. I stayed completely still, listening. My heart was hammering in my chest. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but when I pressed the power button, the screen didn't turn on. Dead battery. I could have sworn I charged it before bed. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. A single, deliberate step, then nothing. I lay there for what felt like hours, but I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the windows. Everything seemed normal. Door locked, windows shut, no footprints on the porch. Maybe I had dreamed the whole thing. But then I noticed my keys were gone. I checked my bag, my jacket, even under the bed. I was sure I had left them on the kitchen counter, but they weren't there. I started feeling uneasy. Things weren't adding up. Still, I convinced myself I had just misplaced them. I spent most of the day searching the cabin and the area around it. Finally, I found them half buried in the dirt behind the cabin. That night, I barricaded the door, dragged the small table in front of it, wedged a chair under the handle, just in case. I didn't sleep much. Every small noise made my skin crawl. I kept my flashlight next to me, checking the time every hour. Nothing happened. Then the power went out. I sat up, gripping the flashlight. The room was completely black, the kind of darkness that messes with your head. I tried the light switch, nothing. My breathing was loud in the silence. I listened, straining my ears, trying to hear anything over my own heartbeat. And then footsteps, slow, careful, right outside the cabin. I couldn't move. I just sat there, staring at the door. The footsteps stopped. The doorknob rattled, gently at first, then more forcefully. The barricade held. I gripped the flashlight, waiting, praying. The rattling stopped. Then, nothing. I don't know how long I sat there. Eventually, the power flickered back on. Everything was quiet. I stayed awake until morning. The next day, I packed my stuff. I didn't care if I had paid for a week. I was leaving. But when I got to my car, the driver's side door was open. Not just unlocked, wide open. My stomach dropped. I had locked it. I was sure I had. I checked inside. My bag had been dumped out. Clothes, toiletries, everything scattered. My phone was lying on the seat. The screen shattered. The keys were still in my pocket, but the car wouldn't start. The engine wouldn't even turn over. I tried again and again, but nothing. It was as if the battery had been drained overnight. That was when I saw them. Footprints, leading from the trees to my car. Bare feet, deep in the mud, but no prints leading away. I grabbed my bag, my flashlight, anything I could carry, and I ran. I didn't care where, just away from that cabin. I followed the road, hoping a car would pass. After an hour, my legs were burning, my throat dry. But then, finally, headlights. I waved frantically. The car stopped. An older man rolled down the window. I must have looked half crazy, but I didn't care. I told him everything. He just listened, his expression unreadable. Then, he nodded slowly and said, "You were lucky." He drove me back to town, never asking another question. I called a tow truck the next morning, had them pick up my car. The mechanic said the battery was completely drained, like something had been pulling power from it all night. I don't know who was out there, or what they wanted. I just know I'm never going back. I never should have gone back to that cabin. It was meant to be a quiet retreat, a week away from everything. Work, people, the endless noise of life. I had rented the place through some backwoods rental site, the kind that doesn't bother with glossy photos or polished descriptions. Just an address, a price, and a key waiting under the mat. It was deep in the woods, miles from any main road. That's what I wanted. Silence, solitude. I got there in the late afternoon. The road had turned from pavement to gravel, then to dirt, winding deeper into the trees. The cabin itself was old, simple, built from thick logs with a sagging porch and a rusted-out truck parked to the side. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. It looked exactly like the kind of place you'd expect to find in some missing persons case. Inside, it was basic. A small kitchen with an old fridge that hummed too loudly, a single bedroom with a bed that looked clean but felt stiff, and a living room with a fireplace, an old couch, and a coffee table covered in knife marks. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just a radio with a broken antenna. That first night was quiet, too quiet, the kind that makes you aware of every creak, every whisper of wind through the trees. I kept telling myself that's what I wanted, but there was something off. I noticed it when I went outside to get firewood. Path. It ran along the edge of the trees, barely noticeable in the fading light. Not an animal trail. It was too straight, too well worn. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about that path. The second day, I followed it. It stretched deeper into the forest, curving around thick trunks, vanishing into the undergrowth. I walked for what felt like an hour before I found the first sign that I wasn't alone. Footprints, fresh, too big to be mine, too defined to be old. Someone had walked this path recently. I stopped and listened. Nothing but the rustling of leaves. But that feeling, the one you get when someone is watching you, settled deep in my gut. I turned back. That night, I locked the door. I wedged a chair under the handle. I listened. The wind had picked up, branches scraping against the roof, but something else was out there. I swear I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. Morning came and I checked outside. The chair was still against the door, but in the dirt just beyond the porch steps were footprints. Big, deep, circling the cabin. Someone had been there. I packed my things. I was ready to leave, but the car wouldn't start. I popped the hood, checked the battery, it was fine. No reason for it not to work. That's when I saw it. A nail, long and rusted, jammed into my back tire. Not an accident. Someone had done it on purpose. I went back inside. I didn't know what else to do. I had no cell service, no neighbors, nothing but miles of empty forest in every direction. I tried to calm myself, but every sound made my pulse jump. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat on the couch, facing the door, a fire poker in my hand. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they didn't stop at the porch. They circled the cabin. Slow, careful, like whoever was out there knew I was listening. I stayed like that until morning. When the sun finally rose, I went outside. More footprints, and something else. A rope, coiled neatly on the porch, right next to the door. I left everything behind, grabbed my keys, my bag, and ran. I didn't care about the tire. I drove on the rim until I hit pavement, until I saw another car, until I reached a gas station where I could breathe again. I called the rental company. They acted like I was crazy, said no one had rented that cabin in months, but someone had been there. Someone had been watching. I never should have gone back to that cabin. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A full weekend alone in a cabin deep in the woods. No distractions, no noise, just peace. The cabin belonged to an old friend of mine who hardly ever used it, and he was happy to let me stay as long as I wanted. I packed enough supplies to last 4 days: food, water, a first aid kit, extra batteries, and my hunting rifle just in case. The drive took longer than expected. The last hour was spent on a narrow dirt road, winding through thick forest. No cell service. The trees crowded the road, making it feel like I was being swallowed whole by the wilderness. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already setting. The place was simple but solid, one story, a steep roof, a small porch out front. The inside was rustic, wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and a kitchen with an old gas stove. A single bedroom with a creaky bed and a heavy wooden dresser. No electricity, just oil lamps and a generator I had no intention of using. I liked the quiet. I unloaded my gear, locked my truck, and settled in. The woods were silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. It was exactly what I wanted. I ate a quick meal, lit a lantern, and read for a while before turning in early. That first night, something woke me up. I wasn't sure what at first. The fire had died down to embers, and the room was cold. Then I heard it again, a dull thud from outside. It sounded like something heavy hitting the ground. A fallen branch? An animal? I listened for a while, but the sound didn't come again. I eventually drifted back to sleep. Morning came, and I stepped outside to get some fresh air. That's when I saw them, footprints in the dirt. Large, booted footprints leading from the tree line to the porch. I froze. I had locked the door before bed. If someone had tried to get in, they hadn't forced it. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The prints led away from the cabin, disappearing into the woods. It made no sense. Who would be out here in the middle of the night? This place was miles from the nearest road. I spent the day exploring the area, trying to shake off the unease. The woods were dense, quiet, untouched. I brought my rifle with me just in case. Every so often, I thought I heard something, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but it was probably just small animals. As the sun started to set, I returned to the cabin. I felt better than I had in the morning. The footprints had been strange, but there was no sign of anyone around. Maybe they had been there before I arrived, and I just hadn't noticed. That night, I made sure to lock up tight. I kept my rifle close just in case. I barely slept. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. A dull thud outside, then another, and another. Footsteps on the porch. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. Silence stretched out for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, the doorknob turned. I sat up, heart hammering in my chest. The lock held, but I heard the soft creak of wood as someone shifted their weight outside the door. Then nothing. I didn't sleep after that. I waited, gripping my rifle, listening to every creak, every whisper of wind against the cabin walls. Eventually, morning came. When I stepped outside, the footprints were there again. This time, they weren't just leading up to the porch. They circled the cabin. I was no longer alone. I packed my things immediately. I had planned to stay for 4 days, but there was no way I was spending another night here. I threw everything into my truck, started the engine, and sped down the dirt road without looking back. I didn't stop until I was an hour away, back on paved roads with my phone buzzing in my lap, finally getting a signal again. Later, my friend called to ask how the trip was. I told him everything. There was a long silence before he spoke. That cabin doesn't have a back door. I never went back. I needed to get away. Life had been weighing down on me, and when my uncle offered his old hunting cabin in the middle of nowhere for a weekend, I took the chance. I packed enough food and water for a few days, threw my rifle in the truck just in case, and drove out. The road was rough, mostly dirt and gravel, winding through miles of dense forest. The farther I went, the less I saw of civilization. No houses, no power lines, no signs of people. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the trees. It was a small, one-room structure made of dark, weathered wood. The windows were old and slightly warped, the glass smudged with dirt. A single porch light flickered weakly as I stepped up to the door. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of dust and aged wood. The furniture was sparse. A bed against the wall, a small table with 2 chairs, and a rusty wood-burning stove. A set of deer antlers hung above the doorway, the only decoration in the place. I locked the door behind me and set my bags down. The first thing I did was check my phone. No service, as expected. That was fine. I was here to be alone. No distractions, no noise, just me and the quiet of the woods. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire in the stove, cooked some canned soup, and sat at the table, listening to the wind outside. Occasionally, I heard the distant howl of a coyote or the snap of a branch in the woods, but nothing unusual. I read a book until my eyes grew heavy, then stretched out on the bed, my rifle within reach, just in case. I woke up sometime after midnight, feeling off. Not scared, exactly, but alert, like something had pulled me from my sleep. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint orange glow. The wind had stopped. The forest outside was completely silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just nothing. I sat up slowly, listening. Then I heard it, a soft crunch of leaves outside, something moving close to the cabin. I grabbed my rifle and crept to the window, pressing my face to the glass. The porch light barely illuminated the front yard, but I could make out the trees, the dirt path leading back to my truck. Nothing else. Another crunch. Closer this time. I held my breath. The sound was coming from the right side of the cabin, near the back. I moved carefully to the back window, my heart pounding. The glass was dirty, but I could see movement, something shifting between the trees. A dark shape, low to the ground, moving slowly. A bear? Maybe, but something felt wrong. The shape didn't move like a bear. It was too smooth, too deliberate. Then, as I watched, it stopped. And for a long moment, nothing happened. Then I saw it. Ahead, just barely visible in the dim light, peeking out from behind a tree. Watching me, I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on the rifle. I wasn't sure what I was looking at. Could have been an animal. Could have been a person. Either way, I wasn't about to find out. I backed away from the window and locked the door, checking the latch twice. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it through the front window, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing. When I turned it toward the back window, I froze. The head was gone, but the shape was closer now. I kept the light on it for a full minute, waiting for it to move. Didn't. It just stood there, half hidden behind the trees. I closed the blinds, my hands shaking. Whatever it was, I wasn't going outside. Not tonight. I sat on the bed, my back against the wall, rifle across my lap. The silence stretched on. Hours passed, but I didn't sleep. Every so often, I'd hear a faint rustling outside, but I refused to look. I just waited, gripping the rifle, forcing myself to stay awake. Eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the blinds. The moment I could see outside, I went to the window. Nothing. The trees stood still, the ground undisturbed. But something was off. The air felt heavy, wrong. I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something had been out there, and I had no intention of staying to find out what. I packed up my things, throwing everything into my truck as fast as I could. Before leaving, I did one last check around the cabin. When I walked to the back, my stomach dropped. Footprints, human footprints, leading from the woods to the back of the cabin. I didn't stop to think. I got in my truck, started the engine, and drove, fast. I didn't look back. I didn't tell my uncle what happened. I didn't tell anyone. But I know what I saw, and I know, without a doubt, that I wasn't alone out there. I remember everything about that weekend at the cabin. The smell of damp wood, the way the cold air crept through the cracks in the walls, the endless silence broken only by the wind scraping tree branches against the roof. It was supposed to be a simple getaway. Just me, a rented cabin deep in the woods, and a few days of peace away from the noise of the city. The drive took longer than I expected. The last 30 miles were on a narrow dirt road, barely wide enough for my car. Trees pressed in on both sides, their branches arching overhead, blocking out the sun. My phone had lost signal an hour earlier, and I hadn't seen another vehicle in at least 50 miles. The isolation felt comforting at first. A break from everything. No distractions, no obligations, just me and the quiet. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the first thing I noticed was how old it looked. The photos online made it seem rustic but well kept. In person, it was different. The wood was faded and cracked, the windows fogged over with dirt. A small porch wrapped around the front, and a set of uneven wooden steps led up to the door. I hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the car. The air was colder than I expected. The trees around the cabin stood tall and unmoving, their bare branches twisting in the windless sky. There was no sound. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness. I grabbed my bag from the car, walked up the steps, and pushed open the door. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and old wood. The furniture was simple. A couch against one wall, a fireplace opposite it, a small kitchen tucked into the corner. A hallway led to a single bedroom and a tiny bathroom. Everything was quiet, too quiet. I spent the first hour settling in. I unloaded my bag, checked the cabinets, found some canned food and a half-empty bottle of whiskey left by the last guest. The water worked, but the pressure was weak, and the pipes groaned when I turned the faucet. There was no cell service, but that was expected. As the sun began to set, I decided to walk the perimeter of the cabin, just to get a feel for the area. The ground was uneven, covered in dead leaves and patches of frost. I found an old, rusted axe leaning against the back wall of the cabin, its blade buried in a stump. A few feet away, a shed sat half-collapsed, its wooden walls buckling under years of neglect. I tried to open the door, but it was stuck. Something about it made me uneasy, so I left it alone. That night, I built a fire in the fireplace. The flames crackled, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I sat on the couch, sipping whiskey, listening to the silence. It should have been peaceful. Instead, it felt wrong, like something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I fell asleep on the couch at some point. When I woke up, the fire had burned low, and the cabin was freezing. Something had woken me, a noise. I sat up, listening. Nothing, just the wind outside. But then I heard it again, a soft, slow creak, like wood bending under weight. My first thought was an animal, a raccoon maybe, but as I listened, the creaking continued. Slow, deliberate, like footsteps on the porch. I held my breath, straining to hear. The noise stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, suddenly, the doorknob rattled. My heart slammed against my ribs. I sat frozen, staring at the door. The knob twisted again, harder this time. Someone was out there. I moved slowly, careful not to make a sound. I reached for the fire poker, gripping it tight. The door was locked, but the cabin was old, the wood weak. If someone wanted in, they could force it. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the rattling stopped. I stayed there, listening, barely breathing. Minutes passed, then an hour. The fire burned lower. My muscles ached from staying so still. Finally, after what felt like forever, I forced myself to stand and creep toward the window. I pulled the curtain back just an inch. The porch was empty. Nothing but darkness beyond the weak glow of the fire inside. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I stepped outside, looking for footprints. The ground was covered in frost, the leaves undisturbed, but the doorknob, it had smudges, as if someone had grabbed it with bare hands. I thought about leaving. I should have, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind had rattled the door. Maybe I was imagining things. I had come here to be alone. I wasn't about to let my own paranoia ruin that. But that night, it happened again. This time, it was different. It wasn't just the doorknob. There were noises outside. The sound of something moving through the trees. Slow, careful steps circling the cabin. I turned off the lights and crouched by the window, gripping the fire poker so tightly my knuckles ached. Then a shadow moved. Someone was standing at the tree line, barely visible in the moonlight, just standing, watching. I didn't move, didn't blink. My heart pounded so hard I thought they might hear it. Then, slowly, they stepped back into the trees and disappeared. I stayed up all night again. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my bag in minutes, grabbed my keys, and threw open the front door, and froze. Footprints, dozens of them, leading up to the porch, circling the cabin, stopping just beneath the windows. And on the door, scratched into the wood, were 4 words: "See you next time." I ran to my car, started the engine, and didn't look back. I don't know who was out there. I don't want to know. I just know I'm never going back. I was never a paranoid person. I didn't jump at noises in the dark or let my mind wander to impossible scenarios. But after what happened in that cabin, I don't think I'll ever feel safe again. It started as a simple trip. 3 days alone in a remote cabin deep in the woods, away from people, noise, and responsibility. I had rented the place online, found it through one of those off-the-grid vacation sites. The pictures showed a small wooden cabin with a wraparound porch, a fire pit out front, and nothing but dense trees in every direction. It was perfect. I wanted solitude, and that's exactly what it promised. The drive up was long. The last 20 miles were on a narrow dirt road that twisted through the forest, the kind of path that made you wonder if you had made a wrong turn somewhere. My truck rumbled over loose rocks, the tires occasionally sliding in the deep ruts left by previous vehicles. My cell service had dropped miles back, but I wasn't worried. I had my supplies, food, water, a rifle just in case, and enough firewood to last the weekend. Everything was planned out. The first few hours were peaceful. I unpacked, checked out the inside of the cabin, and settled in. It was small but cozy. One main room with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom, and a single bedroom. The wooden walls gave it a rustic feel, and the windows let in just enough light to keep the place from feeling cramped. Outside, the silence was almost unnerving. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind moved through the trees. I spent the evening sitting on the porch, drinking a beer, and listening to the forest. It was calming, even with the unsettling quiet. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, I started noticing something strange. The forest had gone completely silent. Not just quiet, silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the distant whisper of the wind. At first, I thought maybe a predator was nearby. A wolf, maybe a bear. But I didn't see anything, and after an hour or so, the normal sounds of the forest never returned. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. I went inside, locked the door, and told myself I was overthinking it. That night, I woke up to a sound outside. It was faint, just a soft crunching noise, like footsteps on the dirt path around the cabin. I stayed still, listening, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had come. Probably an animal, I thought. Maybe a deer. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt. Not just any footprints, bare human footprints. They circled the cabin, stopping at the windows. I checked the locks twice after that. The second night was worse. I woke up again, this time to something tapping on the window. Slow, deliberate, a light, rhythmic sound. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't move. The tapping continued for what felt like forever before it finally stopped. Morning came, and I stepped outside, my rifle in hand. The footprints were back, fresh in the damp earth. This time, they led away from the cabin, vanishing into the trees. Someone had been standing there, watching me while I slept. I wanted to leave. Every instinct told me to pack up and get out. But the rational part of my mind said I was being paranoid. Maybe some drunk hiker had wandered too far. Maybe some local kids were messing with me. I convinced myself to stay. That was a mistake. The third night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in a chair, gun across my lap, every light on in the cabin. I listened. The hours crawled by. Then, around 3 in the morning, the doorknob rattled. A slow, testing movement. Not the wind, not an animal. Someone was trying to get in. I stood up, every muscle in my body tense. The rattling stopped, replaced by something worse. A deep, dragging sound along the wooden walls. A slow scrape, as if someone was running their fingers along the outside of the cabin. I gripped my rifle tighter, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I waited for something else, anything. But the noise never came back. The rest of the night was dead quiet, the kind of silence that felt wrong. At first light, I grabbed my things and left. I didn't care about the refund, didn't care about the supplies I left behind. I got in my truck and drove, tearing down that dirt road faster than I should have. As soon as I had service again, I called the property owner. I told him what happened, told him someone had been outside my cabin every night. He listened quiet, then let out a long sigh. "You're not the first," he said. I felt sick. I asked him what he meant, but he wouldn't say, just told me he was taking the listing down. I never got an explanation, never found out who or what had been out there. But I know this. Someone was watching me. Someone was waiting. And if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have left that cabin at all. I remember the first time I saw the cabin. It was smaller than I had expected, tucked away deep in the woods, hidden between towering pines and thick underbrush. The wooden structure was old, weathered from years of harsh winters and rainstorms. The roof sagged slightly, and the porch creaked under my weight as I stepped up to the door. It wasn't much, but it was supposed to be my home for the next few months. I had rented it out, needing a break from everything. The city, the noise, the stress. I thought some time alone would clear my head. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the silence was unsettling. No car horns, no chatter, just the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant call of some unseen bird. It was supposed to be peaceful. I told myself I needed this solitude. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small kitchen with outdated appliances, a living room with an old wood-burning stove, and a single bedroom in the back. The furniture was sparse: a sagging couch, a wooden rocking chair, a small dining table with 2 chairs. The walls were bare except for a few dusty shelves and an old clock that had stopped ticking long ago. The floor was uneven in places, the wooden planks warped from years of moisture and neglect. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked, made a simple dinner, and sat by the stove, listening to the crackling of the fire. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside, I felt relatively safe. I told myself that the creaks and groans of the cabin were normal. Old houses make noise. The woods make noise. It was all perfectly natural. It wasn't until the second night that I started to feel something was off. I woke up to a sound outside, a soft crunching of leaves, like footsteps. My first thought was an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon scavenging near the porch. But the sound was slow, deliberate, like someone walking, pausing, then walking again. I stayed in bed, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps circled the cabin once, twice, then silence. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But sleep didn't come easy after that. The next day, I checked around the cabin, looking for tracks. The ground was damp from last night's rain, and sure enough, there were prints near the porch. But they weren't hoof prints or paw prints. They were footprints, barefoot, human. A chill ran through me. Maybe someone had been out here just passing through. Maybe some drifter or hiker. But why would they be walking around my cabin in the middle of the night? Barefoot? I spent the rest of the day trying to shake the unease. I chopped wood, cleaned up inside, kept myself busy. But the feeling of being watched never left. Every time I glanced out the window, I expected to see someone standing at the tree line, just watching. But there was never anyone there. That night, I locked the doors and windows. I even moved a chair in front of the door just in case. I kept the fireplace going, the flickering light making shadows dance along the walls. I stayed up late, forcing myself to read, trying to keep my mind occupied. But eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell into a restless sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't footsteps that woke me. It was the sound of something tapping against the window. Light, rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. My body went cold. I didn't move, barely even breathed. The tapping continued. I wanted to believe it was a branch, blown by the wind. But I knew better. It was too precise, too controlled. After what felt like hours, the tapping stopped. Silence pressed in around me. I didn't dare move until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. I checked the window first. There were smudges on the glass, like fingerprints. And outside, in the mud beneath the window, more barefoot prints. I couldn't stay here. That much was clear. This wasn't some harmless animal or wandering traveler. Someone was out here, watching me, playing with me. I packed up what little I had brought and loaded it into my truck. As I turned to lock the cabin door behind me, something caught my eye. On the porch, just outside the door, was a small pile of stones, stacked neatly. Deliberately, I never looked back after that. I drove away down that winding dirt road, back to civilization, back to safety. I never told anyone what happened, because I knew how it would sound. Like paranoia, like some city guy who got spooked by the woods. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And I know that if I had stayed just one more night, I might not have made it out at all. I took the weekend off to clear my head. Work had been draining, and I needed a break from the city. A friend of mine told me about this cabin deep in the woods, miles from any town. He had stayed there once and said it was the quietest place he had ever been. That was exactly what I wanted. No people, no noise, just me, the trees, and the open sky. The drive was long, mostly empty highways and back roads that got narrower the deeper I went into the wilderness. The cabin was far from anything. No gas stations, no convenience stores, just an old dirt road that twisted through the forest. By the time I got there, the sun was already sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows over the clearing where the cabin stood. It wasn't much to look at. The wood was old and dark, the porch sagged slightly, and the windows were covered in dust. There was a small shed off to the side, probably used for firewood. I parked my car next to the cabin and grabbed my bag. The air was crisp and smelled like pine. No traffic sounds, no hum of distant conversations, just the wind rustling through the branches. Inside, the cabin was basic. A single room with a bed, a small kitchenette, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a fireplace. A door in the back led to a tiny bathroom. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, and barely any phone signal. Perfect. I set my bag down, cracked open a beer, and sat on the porch, watching the last bit of sunlight disappear behind the trees. The quiet was almost unnerving at first, but I liked it. That first night, I slept like a rock. The air was cool, the bed was comfortable enough, and the sound of crickets outside lulled me to sleep. I woke up late the next morning, stretched, and stepped outside. The forest was still, too still. I realized I hadn't heard any birds since waking up. No rustling in the underbrush, no distant woodpeckers, just silence. I brushed it off and went about my day. I took a short hike, made some food, and read a book on the porch, but that quiet still nagged at me. Every now and then, I thought I heard something. Small twigs snapping in the distance, the faint crunch of leaves, but every time I looked, there was nothing. That night, I woke up to a noise outside. It wasn't loud, just a soft shuffling sound, like something moving through the leaves. I lay still, listening. It stopped. I told myself it was probably a deer and rolled over. But as I was drifting back to sleep, there was another sound, closer, something tapping against the porch. I held my breath. It was slow and deliberate, like fingers drumming against the wood. Then silence again. I didn't move for a long time, listening for anything else, but eventually, sleep won out. The next morning, I stepped outside and saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints in the dirt. Bare footprints. They led up to the porch, stopped right by the door, and then turned back toward the woods. The air felt colder than before. I spent the day on edge. I didn't hike, didn't read. I just sat there, staring at the trees, feeling watched. By afternoon, I had convinced myself it was just some local messing with me. Maybe a homeless person living out in the woods. That thought made me feel a little better. At least it was a person, not something else. That night, I locked the door and placed a chair under the handle. I had a small hunting knife in my bag, and I kept it within arm's reach as I lay in bed. I told myself it would be fine. Just one more night, and I'd leave in the morning. Sometime past midnight, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't a noise that woke me. It was the feeling of something being wrong. The room was dark, the fireplace dead, and the air was freezing. My breath came out in visible puffs. Then I heard it, a slow creak, the sound of weight shifting on old wooden floors. Inside the cabin, my heart started pounding. I didn't move, barely even breathed. The sound was close, just a few feet away. I gripped the knife under the blanket, forcing myself to stay calm. Then, another creak, this time near the table. I didn't know how they got in. I didn't care. My only thought was getting out. I stayed still for what felt like an eternity, listening to the breathing that wasn't mine. Slow, steady, deliberate. I could feel the presence in the room, the weight of unseen eyes. And then silence. I didn't know if they had left or if they were waiting for me to move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to be patient. I counted the seconds, my fingers gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles ached. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Still nothing. Slowly, carefully, I moved. I slid out of bed, making no noise. My foot touched the floor, and I froze, listening. Nothing. I took another step, moving toward the door. My hands shook as I removed the chair and turned the handle. The door opened with a soft creak. The night outside was black, but I didn't care. I stepped onto the porch and forced myself not to run. The forest loomed around me, empty and silent. I crept toward my car, my breath coming in shaky gasps. The keys were in my pocket. I pulled them out, fingers fumbling. Then I heard it, from inside the cabin. A long, slow exhale. I ran. I yanked the car door open, jumped in, and locked it in one motion. The engine roared to life, and I hit the gas, speeding down that dirt road without looking back. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main highway, miles away from that cabin. Even then, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. By the time I reached home, it was morning. I sat in my car for a long time, just breathing, trying to convince myself it was over. But something kept gnawing at me. When I finally got the nerve to check my phone, I saw something that made my stomach turn. A single notification, a photo, sent from an unknown number. It was my cabin door wide open, and inside, just visible in the darkness, was the faint outline of a person, watching. I always hated being alone in the woods. Something about the silence never sat right with me. It wasn't peaceful. It was too still, too empty, like something was waiting. But I still went. It was supposed to be a weekend trip. A friend of mine had a small, rundown cabin out in the middle of nowhere, deep in the Appalachian woods. He'd bought it a few years ago, some dirt cheap deal that he'd been excited about. He only ever used it for hunting season. Said it was a good spot, far enough from any town that you never saw another person. I wasn't a hunter, but I needed a break from my life, so when he offered to let me borrow it for a couple of days, I took him up on it. The drive out was long. The roads got worse the deeper into the woods I went. The pavement gave way to gravel, then gravel to dirt. My car wasn't built for off-roading, and I felt every bump and dip in the road. The trees stretched tall on both sides, the bare branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. I checked my phone. No service. Figures. When I finally got to the cabin, the sun was already dipping low. The place was nothing special. Just a small, single-story thing with a slanted roof and faded wooden siding. There was a porch with a couple of old chairs, their paint peeling from years of weather. The front door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust. The place smelled like old wood and mildew. There was a small kitchen to the left, a living area with a sagging couch and a wood-burning stove. A single hallway led to the bedroom and a tiny bathroom. Everything was basic, functional, but just barely. The walls were thin, and I could hear the wind whistling outside. I dropped my bag in the bedroom. The bed was just a mattress on a wooden frame, covered in an old quilt. The window beside it had no curtains, just a clear view of the darkening woods. I turned away from it. Something about staring into the trees made my skin crawl. I spent the first night in silence. No TV, no radio, just the sounds of the cabin settling and the occasional rustling outside. Probably animals. At least that's what I told myself. The first weird thing happened that night. I woke up around 2 a.m., my heart pounding for no reason. The room was dead quiet. Too quiet. I couldn't hear the wind anymore. Just silence. I sat up, listening. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not loud, but deliberate. Crunching over dead leaves, moving just outside the cabin. Slow. Steady. I held my breath. My brain went through the possibilities: deer, a raccoon, maybe a coyote. But it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like a person. I stayed still, listening. The footsteps stopped just below my bedroom window. I stared at the dark glass, my stomach twisting. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Someone was there. I stayed like that for what felt like forever. Then, just as suddenly as they came, the footsteps moved away, disappearing into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. Morning came slow. I checked around the cabin, but there was nothing. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Maybe it was an animal, and I'd let my nerves get the best of me. I spent the day trying to relax. I took a short walk around the property, stayed close to the cabin. The trees felt too tall, too close, like they were swallowing the sky. I didn't like how quiet everything was. No birds, no rustling, just stillness. That night, it happened again. The same time. The same slow, deliberate footsteps. This time, I forced myself to move. I grabbed the flashlight beside my bed and shined it out the window. Nothing. The light cut through the trees, illuminating the twisted branches, the thick undergrowth. But no one was there. I barely slept. The next morning, I was exhausted. I thought about leaving, but I told myself I was overreacting. 2 nights of bad sleep were making me paranoid. That was all. The third night was worse. I had locked the door. I was sure of it. But around midnight, I heard something inside the cabin. A creak of wood. A shift in the air. My stomach dropped. I reached for the flashlight again, my hands shaking. When I turned it on, the beam landed on the bedroom door. It was open. I hadn't left it open. My breathing was too loud. I forced myself to move, to get up, to check the rest of the cabin. The front door was still locked. The windows were shut. Nothing looked out of place. But the air felt wrong, heavy, like something had been there, like something was still watching. I didn't sleep at all after that. I sat up with my flashlight in my hand, listening to every creak and groan of the old cabin. When the sun came up, I packed my things. I didn't care if I looked stupid. I wasn't staying another night. I threw my bag in the car and started down the dirt road, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles went white. I didn't relax until I hit pavement, until I saw the first signs of civilization. Only then did the tightness in my chest ease. I don't know what was out there. Maybe a squatter. Maybe some lunatic living in the woods. Maybe just my own paranoia. But I do know one thing. I will never go back to that cabin. And I'll never be alone in the woods again. I drove up the mountain road, watching as the trees swallowed the last hints of civilization behind me. The gravel crunched under my tires, the sound growing louder as I slowed to take a sharp turn. My cabin, my grandfather's cabin, really sat somewhere ahead, tucked deep into the woods, away from everything. I hadn't been here in years, not since I was a kid. But when life in the city got too loud, too heavy, I remembered this place. The air changed as I climbed higher, growing cooler, cleaner. The trees pressed in close, their thick trunks forming a wall on either side of the narrow road. I hadn't seen another car for miles. That was the whole point. Just a weekend, I told myself. A few days to clear my head, to breathe. The cabin appeared suddenly, like it had been waiting for me. The wood was darker than I remembered, the roof sagging slightly at the corners. A thick layer of leaves blanketed the porch. I parked in the clearing and killed the engine. The silence was immediate, almost unnatural after the hum of the car. I grabbed my bag and walked up the steps, testing each one before putting my weight on it. The door groaned as I pushed it open. Dust hung in the air, thick and undisturbed. I ran a hand over the old wooden table, leaving a streak behind. The place was exactly how my grandfather left it. The stone fireplace, the worn-out couch, the tiny kitchen tucked into the corner. A single hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom. The air smelled like old wood and something else, something stale. I dropped my bag on the couch and opened a few windows, letting the cool air sweep in. I spent the first hour cleaning, wiping down surfaces, shaking out the blankets, sweeping dust into little piles that never quite disappeared. The work settled my nerves. I told myself I wasn't scared, that I'd grown up in this cabin, that nothing was out here except trees and deer and the occasional bear. But something about the silence felt wrong. I stepped outside as the sun began to set, standing on the porch and looking out at the dense forest. The trees stretched endlessly, shifting shadows as the light faded. The wind stirred the branches, making them whisper against each other. Then I saw it, just for a second. A shape deep in the trees, too tall for an animal, too still to be the wind. My heart thumped hard against my ribs. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was nothing, my eyes playing tricks on me, adjusting to the dimming light. I stepped back inside and locked the door. The old bolt slid into place with a heavy click. I checked the windows twice before turning on the lantern. The first night passed in restless sleep. Every creak of the cabin woke me. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the glass panes. I thought I heard footsteps once, crunching outside in the leaves, but I told myself it was an animal. The forest was full of them. Morning came slow and gray. I made coffee on the old stove and stepped onto the porch. The clearing looked different in daylight, less menacing, more familiar. But the feeling in my gut hadn't gone away. I decided to check the perimeter, just to ease my mind. The grass was still damp with morning dew as I walked around the cabin, scanning the ground for tracks. Nothing unusual, no signs of anyone or anything. But then, behind the cabin, I saw them. Footprints. They weren't mine. Too large, too deep in the soft earth. They led from the tree line to the back window, then stopped. No return trail. I stared at them, my skin crawling. Someone had been here, standing at my window, watching. I rushed inside and locked the door. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. I was too deep in the mountains for that. I needed to leave. I packed my bag in minutes, shoving everything inside without care. I grabbed my keys, threw open the door, and froze. The footprints were gone. The earth was smooth, undisturbed, like they'd never been there at all. I stepped onto the porch, my breath coming fast. I knew what I saw. I wasn't crazy. I backed toward my car, keys clenched in my fist. Then I heard it, a branch snapping. Close, too close. I turned fast, scanning the trees. Nothing, just the empty woods. But the feeling was back, heavy in my chest, that I was being watched. I yanked open the car door and slid inside, shoving the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered but didn't start. I turned the key again. Nothing. A third time, the engine groaned, coughed, and fell silent. I gripped the wheel, forcing myself to breathe. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe I flooded the engine. Then I saw them, deep in the trees just beyond the clearing. A figure, standing still, watching me. My blood turned to ice. I tried the key one more time, my hands shaking. The car roared to life. I didn't hesitate. I threw it into reverse, tires kicking up gravel as I spun around. I didn't look back as I sped down the dirt road, branches scraping against the car. I didn't stop when I hit pavement, didn't breathe until I saw the first signs of town. I checked into a motel that night, double-locking the door. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The next morning, I called a tow truck to go back for my car. When they brought it, the driver gave me a strange look. "Saw your cabin while I was up there," he said. "You know someone's been staying there, right?" I stared at him. "What?" "Yeah," he said, scratching his head. Fresh footprints all over the place. And the door was wide open. I never went back. I should have turned back when I saw the gas station attendant shake his head at me. He didn't say a word, just stood there on the wooden porch of that rundown place, watching me as I pumped gas. His eyes told me everything, but I ignored it. I had already paid for the rental, already planned the whole trip, and I wasn't about to back out now. I was going to spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the woods. No work, no emails, no people. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. I had dreamed of this kind of solitude for years, and now I finally had it. The drive to the cabin took longer than I expected. The paved road turned to gravel and then to dirt. My car's tires kicked up dust, and the further I went, the less I saw of the sky. The trees grew thicker, pressing in from both sides. The road was barely wide enough for my car, and I had to drive slow to avoid the deep potholes. There was no cell service. That was expected, but seeing the signal disappear made my stomach tighten a little. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already starting to set. The place was small, just one story with a slanted roof, a porch, and a chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The wood was dark, weathered, but still sturdy. There was a shed out back, padlocked. I didn't bother checking it. I had no reason to. I unloaded my stuff, set up the small kitchen, and lit the fireplace. The inside was exactly what I had expected. Basic furniture, old wooden floors, a bed in the corner, and a single bathroom. The windows had thick curtains, and the door had 2 locks. I checked them both twice. Not because I was scared, just because it felt right. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. When you spend every day surrounded by the sounds of the city, car horns, sirens, people talking, you forget how loud silence can be. The wind through the trees, the occasional creak of the cabin settling, my own breathing. That was all I heard. I barely slept. Every time I drifted off, some small noise woke me up, a rustle outside, the groan of a tree bending in the wind. I told myself it was nothing. The second day, I explored a little. There was a lake not too far from the cabin, maybe a 15-minute walk through the trees. The water was still, dark, and untouched. No boats, no docks, just nature. I spent the afternoon there, sitting on the shore, enjoying the peace. When I walked back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The door was open, not wide open, just a few inches, but I knew I had closed it. I knew I had locked it. My first thought was that maybe I hadn't pulled it shut all the way. Maybe the wind had pushed it open. That had to be it. Still, my hands were shaking as I stepped inside. Nothing was out of place. My bags were where I left them. The food was still on the counter. Nothing was missing, but I still felt it. Something was off. That night, I locked the door again. I checked it 3 times. I dragged a chair in front of it just in case, and I barely slept. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. Not mine. They were fresh, leading from the trees to the porch, and then back into the woods. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, trying to make sense of it. I wasn't crazy. Someone had been here. Someone had walked up to the cabin in the night, and then left. I packed my stuff. I didn't even think about it. I threw everything into my bag and carried it out to the car. The keys were in my pocket. I was ready to go. The car wouldn't start. It wasn't the battery. The lights came on, the dashboard lit up. But when I turned the key, the engine just clicked. I tried again, and again. Nothing. I sat there for a while, gripping the wheel, forcing myself to breathe. This wasn't happening. Couldn't be. But it was. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat on the couch. My mind was racing. I had no way of calling for help. No way of leaving. I told myself I would wait until morning, hike back down the road, and find someone, anyone. That was the plan. But that night, I heard them. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Moving outside the cabin. Someone was out there, just beyond the walls. I could hear the leaves crunching under their weight. They weren't trying to be quiet. They wanted me to hear them. I sat in the dark, gripping the fireplace poker. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then twice, then silence. I didn't sleep. I waited. Every sound made my heart pound. I watched the door, the windows. I didn't turn on a light. I just waited for morning. As soon as the sun came up, I left. I grabbed my bag, a bottle of water, and started walking. I didn't look back. I just walked. The road felt longer than before. The trees felt closer. Every sound made me flinch. I walked for hours. My legs ached. My throat was dry, but I didn't stop. And then, just when I thought I would never reach the main road, I saw it. A truck, parked near the gas station. A man was standing next to it, smoking. I ran to him, out of breath, my words a mess. He didn't say anything at first, just listened. Then he nodded once, like he had heard it all before. "You're lucky," he finally said. "Some folks don't make it out." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. I never went back for my car. Never looked up the cabin again. Whatever was out there, whoever was watching me, I wasn't going to give them a second chance. I don't know if I'll ever sleep right again. It's been a week since I left that cabin, and I still can't shake the feeling that I left something unfinished. Or maybe something unfinished is still waiting for me. I had rented the place for a few days, hoping for some quiet. Work had drained me. City noise had started to wear on my nerves, and I needed to clear my head. A buddy of mine told me about this cabin up in the mountains. It was far from the nearest town, deep enough in the woods that I wouldn't hear anything but nature. Sounded perfect. Just me, some books, and the stillness of the wilderness. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the peaks. The drive up was rough. The road was more of a dirt path, full of potholes and lined with thick trees that seemed to lean in too close. By the time I reached the cabin, my car was coated in dust. The cabin itself looked sturdy, made of old, weathered wood. It was small but had everything I needed: a bed, a kitchenette, a fireplace, and a tiny bathroom. There was a deck out back overlooking a sloping patch of forest. No neighbors, no roads in sight, just trees stretching out in every direction. That first night was peaceful. I sat on the deck with a beer, listening to the crickets. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I turned in early, feeling the kind of deep exhaustion that only fresh air brings. But sometime in the night, I woke up. It wasn't a noise that woke me, not exactly. More like a shift, a feeling that something had changed. I lay there, staring at the dark ceiling, my ears straining. The forest outside was silent, too silent. No crickets, no wind, just dead air. I sat up, my skin prickling. I reached for my phone, but there was no service. I hadn't expected much signal this far out, but something about being completely cut off in that moment unsettled me. I got up and walked to the window. The moon was bright, casting silver light over the trees. Everything looked normal, but that silence, it was wrong. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. But I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I forced myself to shake off the weird feeling. I made coffee, ate breakfast, and decided to explore a little. I found a trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. The trees were thick, their branches tangled like fingers. The air was cool under the canopy, but there was a damp, rotten smell that I couldn't place. About half a mile in, I found something strange. A clearing with a pile of old, rusted tools. An axe head without a handle, a saw with broken teeth, a hammer so rusted it looked like it had been sitting there for years. But there were no signs of a cabin, no remnants of a structure. Just tools, abandoned in the middle of nowhere. I felt a chill creep up my spine. There was something wrong with the place. The way the trees seemed to lean inward, the way the silence felt too thick. I turned back, walking faster than I meant to. By the time I reached the cabin, my heart was hammering. I spent the rest of the day inside, trying to read, but I couldn't focus. Every little noise made me jump. By evening, the silence had returned. The same suffocating quiet. I kept checking the window, half expecting to see something moving in the trees. But there was nothing, just stillness. That night, I woke again. This time, it was a sound, faint, barely there. A soft scraping like something dragging against wood. I held my breath, listening. Came again from outside, from the deck. I grabbed the flashlight by my bed and clicked it on. The beam shone weakly through the window, illuminating the deck. Nothing. I hesitated, then slowly made my way to the door. I pressed my ear against it, heart pounding. The sound had stopped. I counted to 10, then cracked the door open, shining my light outside. The deck was empty. The forest beyond was black, the trees like shadows against shadows. But then I saw it. Faint scratches on the wooden planks. Fresh. They hadn't been there before. I locked the door and sat up the rest of the night, every nerve on edge. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to find out. I packed my things, loaded up the car, and got the hell out. As I pulled onto the dirt path, I glanced at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw them. Footprints, leading from the trees to the deck. Bare footprints pressed into the damp earth. I drove faster, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on paved roads, back where I could see other cars and hear the normal sounds of the world. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know, but I can still feel it. That silence, that waiting, like something unfinished, still lingering in the trees, watching, listening, and maybe, just maybe, still waiting for me to come back.